We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 144 of That Shakespeare Life. Today's episode is brought to you by Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is the membership arm of That Shakespeare Life that offers you monthly digital history activity kits that let you try at home the history you learn about on the show. They work like science labs for history. Stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Todd Butler, Associate Dean and Professor of English in the College of Arts and Sciences at Washington State and author of Literature and Political Intellection in Early Stuart England. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
They would boil down human fat, and it was called hangman's grease, and that was used to apparently heal broken bones and also aid in the pain of joints.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Many famous people from history have had their lives come to an end by execution. We tell these stories with gusto, reverence, and sometimes even humor, but the person responsible for being the executioner goes largely unnoticed beyond the recognition that someone, albeit we rarely know who, had to actually be the executioner. The word executioner comes up in Shakespeare's plays 17 times, twice referred to as a common executioner, twice mentioned in context of characters expressing their distaste for the profession, and a few times mentioned in the stage directions as a character appearing on stage. But what was an executioner supposed to look like on stage in the 16th century? If it was a common profession, how did someone become an executioner? Who were England's executioners? How were they hired for this repulsive job? And with something so repugnant as a career choice that several characters in Shakespeare's plays verbalize how much they hate the idea of being an executioner, what must it have been like to live in early modern England as an executioner? Were there personal ramifications against them for the performance of their duties? Here to help us answer these questions and explore the profession of official executioner in early modern England is our guest, DJ Guba. David A. Guba Jr. is a historian of drugs, violence, and colonialism in modern France and Europe, and an assistant professor of history at Bard Early College in Baltimore, Maryland. His research and publications cover a range of topics in European history, including executioners and capital punishment, women and gender in Nazi Germany, and the colonial history of cannabis in France. He is the author of Axed from History, Executioners in Early Modern Europe, published online, which explores the largely ignored and mythologized history of the men and women who served as executioners in Europe's past. His research in this area focuses on the lives and legacies of the Sanson family of executioners who supplied 7 consecutive generations of axemen to the French state from the reign of Louis XIV through the Revolution to the reign of Louis-Philippe I. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, The Conversation, Salon, and Slate, and his first book, Taming Cannabis, Drugs and Empire in 19th Century France, was recently published by McGill Queen's University Press. Hello, DJ. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks for having me.
How were executioners selected for this job? Is this a profession that one could choose independently? Like, did you grow up and say, I'm going to be this when I grow up? Or were they appointed somehow by maybe the government or the crown?
Executioners in the early modern period came from one of 3 sources, and they were generally appointed by the crown or the intermediaries of the crown. The first and dominant source of executioners was that they came from a family of executioners. So most of the executioners you'll meet or hear from or hear about in England, in Germany, in France, during this early modern period were born into this family. We can think of the Brandons or Pierrepoints in England in the 17th and 20th centuries, the Guillaumes and the Sanson families in France from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And then, of course, the famous Schmitz in Germany in the 16th century, a father and son combination. And the main reason that they were born into this is there was a significant system of what's called social pollution or social contamination. So when you were part of this executioner profession and this part of the family, you were considered spiritually problematic or profane, but also there was this biological component where your job as a murderer, and thus the Christian sort of understanding of what murder constituted in terms of sin, combined to make you someone that was to be physically avoided and not touched. So every aspect of the execution itself was handled by the executioner and his family, who generally constituted the assistants, made up the assistants who were working with him. The other area that you find some executioners coming from is through the prisons or through a system of more or less reprieve from punishment. So they themselves were caught for theft or punished for or found guilty of murder or some pretty serious crime. And then the judge would offer them reprieve from this crime if they would become the executioner. And there's a very famous executioner named Black Moll, who was actually a woman, and she was given this opportunity, I suppose, to get out of her own execution after being caught for theft or charged with witchcraft. The exact crime is escaping me. But during the 1650s in Bermuda, she served as the executioner and came from this sort of prison pipeline, I would argue. The third source is more a traditional job search. So in the 1700s and the 1800s, several places, for instance, the city of London, put out ads, and you would just apply for the job like you would any old job. So these three areas were usually where executioners came from. And also the military. So prisoners who were imprisoned because of their actions and behavior in the military, or prisoners who were charged with civil and criminal crimes.
So when you say that by the 17 to 1800s, they could apply for this job, was that option available to someone in the 1500s and 1600s as well, or did that not arrive until after Shakespeare's lifetime?
From my research, that doesn't arrive until after Shakespeare's lifetime. Most of the executioners who are operating in the 1500s and the 1600s are largely going to come through the prison and military sort of pipeline. You'll see a lot of overlap there. And those mostly will be appointed by someone in the crown or someone in the higher echelons of the military.
So mostly it was you were born into this, or it's a type of work release program?
For the most part. It's not until the 1800s. And Billington is sort of an exception that you see an application system. And Billington was a Sunday school teacher and a barber before he ultimately became an executioner. And he beat out something like 90 people in the application pool to ultimately get that job. So that feels very modern compared to the traditional social pollution, more Middle Ages Christian paradigm of how the executioner was understood in society during the time of Shakespeare.
Well, we know Shakespeare included executioners in the stage direction of some of his plays, which makes me wonder if they were visually recognizable. Did executioners have a specific uniform that they had to wear?
No, and this is a misnomer or a stereotype that's untrue about executioners in popular culture. The hooded, clad in black clad, sort of brutish executioner, almost portrayed as mindless or unthinking or blindly loyal to the king or crown, is really not the stereotype or the common model or even average executioner that you'll see, particularly in dress. The most common, and there are some images, woodcuts and paintings of executioners during the 14, 15, 1600s, and of course into the 17 and 1800s. But in the time of Shakespeare, what you'll see is a wide range of uniforms. And yes, the executioner would have been widely known by everybody, because in order to be isolated and physically avoided to get rid of this social pollution, which was in many ways the key necessity of the key thing that allowed the executioner to really do his job in the first place. He was committing these sins on a near weekly, monthly basis for the crown. In some places it was quarterly. They would wait and gather up enough executions and do it quarterly. But they would wear a range of outfits. So Franz Schmidt in Germany was known to oftentimes, depending on the nature of the sort of status of the individual he was executing, he would wear military garb with armor. Other times, if it didn't matter, if it was a matter of torture, you'll see him in woodcuts, merely wearing the outfit of a normal laborer, pants and a shirt, sometimes without a shirt. So no, there is no uniform costume. And in each place you see, and across different times and different executioners, you will see a range of costumes that very rarely will include a hood. The times that they do include a hood, for instance, in England in the 1680s, when Charles I is executed, that was a very high-profile execution after a civil war. So the anonymity of the executioner was really important for any sort of post-conflict struggle that might erupt, and vengeance could be played out, and so on and so forth. So there are moments where the executioner is hooded, but it's usually a matter of needing that executioner to be anonymous for exceptional political circumstances.
Were there executioners who were given a higher rank than others? For example, with the execution of someone like Anne Boleyn, who was queen at the time of her death, would they have selected an executioner of higher status for this purpose, or were all deaths treated the same?
On average, based on my research, particularly continentally in Europe as well, but in England, I think this holds true, the status of the person being executed really only meant where they would be executed rather than who would be executing them. So the difference would be where. In England during the time of Shakespeare, 1500s into the 1600s, if you were the average person down to a peasant, you'd be executed likely by hanging up at Tyburn. If it was a more revolutionary issue, if you were someone that was rebelling against the king and crown, you would be executed, probably drawn, quartered, and beheaded at the cathedral, or perhaps even behind closed doors at the Tower. That was sort of if you were looking at class distinction, the higher up in class you were, generally the cleaner of an execution you received. And sometimes that would mean bringing in a better executioner. So in the case of Anne Boleyn, she famously knew something about this executioner being brought in from France, who was an expert swordsman from Calais. I wasn't able to find in the research I did before our conversation the particular name of the man from Calais. But it was said that either Anne Boleyn was able to request this swordsman because it was known that he could end this process quite painlessly and with one swing. And it's also rumored that perhaps the king intervened, Henry intervened in an attempt to try to show some half measure in mercy, I suppose. But that is an instance in which Anne Boleyn, being quite a high-profile figure, is given this privilege of being executed by someone with a bit more skill and a bit more, I would say, class. But nonetheless, someone who's still an executioner. But in most instances, the appointed executioner and their assistants, they handled the executions in the particular monarch's jurisdiction, regardless of the condemned person's status. And then there were also journeyman executioners. So if you were a young son of an executioner who was still practicing, part of your apprenticeship would be that you would travel out into the country and take care of any rural, small city executions that the crown needed done as well. Those might be lower profile in a sense and done in a more crude, maybe perhaps even brutal way because of the lower class nature of many of those criminal proceedings compared to what's going on in London perhaps, or Paris or Frankfurt or Nuremberg. But yeah, usually it was for the most part, class was only reflected in and status only reflected in the kind of execution rather than who was doing it.
So we've established there is some variance in skill when it comes to this particular job. And I don't want to go too far into the macabre, but there was more than one way to kill a person, even as capital punishment during Elizabethan England. There was hanging, a guillotine, and an axe, all being methods of dispatching someone in a formal execution. DJ, was there some kind of guild or training program established that taught executioners how to use the machines involved in this profession?
Yes, not a formal guild in the sense of a guild you might find in early pharmacy or medicine or some sort of artisanal guild. It was a very endogamous guild, meaning and I don't mean inbreeding. I mean more of if you have a family of executioners, they're really limited in who they can mate with, essentially, to be crude about it. And you often have this endogamous intermarrying of executioners. So the apprenticeship follows this same model of endogamy, largely, again, because of this social pollution is the word. And that's a very harsh term, but that's the term. And it's very much like, I think of it almost in terms of the caste system and the way the caste system operates in ancient Hindu cultures, particularly of India, in which there's physical space in which certain castes are unable to go into. The executioner very much was confined to such policing inside physical space. So their apprenticeship program didn't have the opportunity to really be sponsored by anybody other than the executioners. So oftentimes the apprentices were the official executioners and their sons, or the sons would apprentice under them. So they would be the ones running the apprenticeship. And then what you also will find is executioners will send their sons, for instance, the Saint-Saëns did this quite regularly, to work with other executioners at other cities. So they'll send their son to Lyon, and they'll work with an executioner in Lyon and gain the skill and expertise that they need and experience they need, and the very wide range of torture tactics as well as killing methods. And after they learn their craft, and there is training. There is a training regimen that Franz Schmidt, for instance, talks about, where before they start, swinging away at human beings, because there is consequence. If an executioner bungles an execution and it requires multiple swings of the axe, there are several studies. Peter Stierenberg, he found numerous instances, if it was over 3 swings, and meaning a very brutal, horrific, inhumane execution, the crowds would often turn on the executioner, and sometimes, what would amount to executing the executioner, lynching the executioner. So it was very important that they knew their skills and they knew what they were doing, and they could handle a sword. And they would practice on inanimate objects like pumpkins, is what Franz Schmidt talks about. They would practice, unfortunately, on other living things, animals, particularly dogs. And this was the training regimen that would allow them to gain the experience and skills necessary to ensure that they did swift justice. And many of them did care. From our perspective, it might not seem that caring from modern perspectives. However, Franz Schmidt talks quite a bit about, and he actually goes in certain instances, there were 2 women or 3 women convicted of witchcraft, and they were to be burned or drowned or both. One or the other. And he said, this is horrific. We can't do this. And instead, of course, he said, I'll take care of it with 1 swing of the axe. So that was considered, humane and noted by many contemporaries at the time as humane treatment. But all of that flows from this very serious but very internal training system that was part of the young executioner's path. Particularly if you were born into this, you would start at a very, very young age working as an assistant, helping build the scaffolding and gallows, because at the end of the day, the executioner couldn't really hire anybody to do that because they feared social pollution.
In his paper, Axed from History, Executioners in Early Modern England, DJ writes about one man whose career as an executioner is extensively documented, and all indications are he flies in the face of all modern reputations and images we have of what an executioner was supposed to be. DJ, you've mentioned him before, but I want you to highlight him here for us. How did Franz Schmidt, the 16th century professional executioner, challenge our image of this mindless, brutish executioner?
So Franz Schmidt was the exact opposite in many ways of the stereotypical executioner you're going to see in picture books or, sensational literature that describes in gory detail what's going on in the history of executioners. Franz Schmidt was literate, which was very important for the time, and his ability to also do several side gigs, which I'll talk about in a second. He was, as I said, the opposite of the hooded, gargantuan, unthinking axeman. In his journal, as I said earlier, he describes he cares not only about the nature of his profession and executing it properly and efficiently, but he also cares about the suffering of the people that he is ultimately charged with murdering in the name of the state and of the crown. So in terms of brutishness, that kind of flies out the window as soon as you get into his journal, which remains to us today, and which Joel Harrington, historian at Vanderbilt University, has done an amazing job revitalizing and reintroducing in new translation. So Franz Schmidt was literate. He was cultured. He was somewhat respected in the community and even attempted somewhat successfully to intervene in different political matters. He petitioned, for instance, different councils in German cities, for instance, Frankfurt, Nuremberg. Thier also was someone he petitioned to try to elevate his family's name out of this position of social pollution to officially become titled as someone important in German society, especially as a medical doctor. He was unsuccessful in this, but that shows, he wasn't just some axe-swinging brute. He was, somebody who practiced medicine on the side and was quite successful at it. Not medicine like we think today, but executioners, by virtue of being able to be around and have access to cadavers, they had this proximity, one, to the bodies, but also the expertise in dealing with, when you break bodies and you see the anatomy deconstructed, working backwards from that point, mentally speaking, gave them great knowledge about how the physical body works. So some of the earliest surgeons, some of the earliest what were called barber surgeons at the time, people practicing autopsy and dissection in the cover of night and behind closed door, because it was very much illegal into the 1700s and 1800s until Enlightenment-based, particularly Parisian school-based science took over. But Franz Schmidt was right in the middle of that, and heavily involved with providing herbal remedies for people suffering different infectious diseases and skin diseases, also preparing some very, what we might consider macabre remedies. For instance, they would boil down human fat, and it was called hangman's grease, and that was used to apparently heal broken bones and also aid in the pain of joints. They would grind up skulls and bones and make that into a powder that could be ingested or dissolved into certain medicines and then ingested as medicine. So people sought out these remedies and believed in the spiritual power of them, but also in the medical power of them. Because another big thing in England in the time of Shakespeare was the hangman's, they called it the hangman's arm or hand, I believe. So the hand of a person just executed, if it was chopped off, it was believed to have this medical and spiritual power. And of course, who accessed and had control over that, physical piece of the person executed, but the executioner. And while that all, to our perspective, seems quite brutish from 2020, it was nonetheless the tip of the spear of science, cutting edge, very much ridiculed and critiqued from the perspective of the humoral theory and medieval medicine and Christian doctrine, but what would eventually become a great foundation on which modern medicine grew in the 1800s. So Franz Schmidt, if you were to ask Franz Schmidt to identify himself and what it means to be an executioner, he would view it as a socially upward path from which he could move his family into the realm of traditional proper medical practice. That's how I would describe him. And that's very different than your normal portrayal.
So despite being people that needed to be avoided in a very isolated, almost, the way we think of lepers in a sense, there were actually some overlap with society where people would go and find them for these remedies when they needed them?
Yes, absolutely. They were Franz Schmidt, the Sansons, especially the middle generations who were practicing or were executioners officially for Paris during the Revolutionary period and during the Restoration period. They all reported making double to 3 to 4 times as much money. Franz Schmidt says 4, Sansons are more in the double range, more money in the medical realm of their practices than they did in the actual executioner realm of their practices. And the other thing about this porousness that you rightly point out and are attuned to here between, this social pollution and also being incredibly important for the functioning of medieval society, right? Like without the executioner, where's the public display of justice that keeps people in line, right? But the cost of that public display of justice, the violence, the brutishness, is this person's, social position in society. They quite think that the person's soul is damaged, and therefore they need to back off and make sure that their soul doesn't get damaged by it. But the porousness exists. For instance, in France, and I think this exists in English context and German context as well, there's basically a donation called avage that's given by townspeople to the executioner. And the executioner would walk around, or an assistant of the executioner, the Sansons would walk around in the market and in other towns throughout France, because it's not just the Sansons, it's many executioners and many families of executioners. And they would hold out a bag, or they put a crate at the end of the street where the market was, and the market people and vendors would put free food for the executioner in the bag or the basket. And that's how the executioner was fed. They didn't have to pay taxes and tithes in many areas as well. So they had this very liminal position, in-between position in society that was, in my mind, as a historian, it served as this very odd glue that kept not only the justice, the lack of justice, the juridical system of medieval England and France and Europe together to a large degree, but it also kept a lot of medieval thinking and Christian thinking alive about particularly how disease in the body and death function. It's quite fascinating. It's both incredibly modern and incredibly pre-modern, all in one.
We know several criminals who were executed had their heads put on pikes and displayed on London Bridge. Was it the job of the executioner to put these heads there after a public execution?
Yeah, I had to look into this because this is a very sort of logistical question. But at the end of the day, I think, and there are certainly going to be exceptions to this, it was ultimately the job of the executioner and their particular assistants to handle the execution from start to finish, and really from planning to completion. So that meant building the scaffold, sharpening the axe, in some instances creating and building and forging the materials you need, the very weapons, obtaining the wheel if you're going to break someone with a wheel. And that's all the way through the disposal of the body to where the body is going to sit if there is indeed a display going to be made of the body. For instance, quartering, the body being split into quarters and then quite literally put in four corners of the city as a sign to all potential criminals that this is what will happen to you. That was very much done by the executioner and likely his assistants. For instance, the holding up of the head of King Louis XVI was famously done not by the Sanson, but by a Sanson assistant. So that shows you that it really, so long as the chain of command, not to belittle human remnants and bodies and life and death, but the chain of command of the actual physical property of the body is going to carry that same worry of social pollution. So I'm sure it happened. I'm absolutely sure it happened. I just haven't seen it in historical record in my research thus far. But I can't imagine being, a guard at a jail who's then asked to take care of, possession of this head and put it on a spike. They would quite very much literally worry about not only their soul, but their social position in society. People would no longer want to touch them. People would no longer want to marry them. This really doesn't wear off. What's fascinating about the family of Sansons that I mentioned quite a bit, and I study quite a bit, is that starts to wear off the late 1700s into the 1800s. And I think, and there are different theories as to why this happens, and I think it has a lot to do with the advent of liberal politics and economics and just the growth of, but again, France just veers right back into monarchy, so that's a hard argument to make. But by the 1800s, the Sansons have some clout. Like they're walking around France, living in nice houses, interacting with the bourgeois from not only France, but the rest of Europe. People are coming to, get pictures later in the century, late 1800s, holding pieces of the guillotine or the supposed blade that chopped off Marie Antoinette's head, which was definitely lost, but the elder Sanson said he had it and people would come pay him to look at it. So yeah, to answer your question, what you originally said, it would be the executioner and his assistants. Yeah.
What was the cultural opinion in England during Shakespeare's lifetime about the event of a public execution? You've mentioned that associating with an executioner or his family or his network of people was not just distasteful, but something to be avoided on pain of death or compromising your eternal soul. These all seem very serious worries to consider, but I feel like the actual event of the public execution was widely attended. So were these events considered distasteful, or was this a public gathering when these executions would occur?
The exact opposite, to quickly answer the question. And the way you framed it, I've not thought of it this way, but it's almost as if all of the shame that the community should be feeling about what's going on is embodied by the executioner themselves. And what I mean by that is, if you're somebody in England in the 1500s and 1600s or France or Germany, throughout Europe at this time to a large part, you want to be at the execution. And the government, the crown, wants you to be at the execution. That's what makes this whole thing work. Without that public display, this public spectacle of brutality and violence and goriness from our perspective, from the perspective then of the government particularly, this was, to use a very Weberian Max Weber type term, it was the monopolization of power by the crown, and all of the shame and guilt associated with that in terms of Christian ideals was placed into the body of the executioner, into the actions of the executioner, into the very blood and family line of the executioner. So the people were there to be in many ways entertained. And you find in England and elsewhere, tickets being sold for the best seats. You find concessions being sold for drink and food and fruits. You find playbills or essentially pamphlets that will describe what the criminal has done and their rap sheet. And a little bit about the executioner even you'll find in some of these pamphlets. So these are events made for consumption, and they are made for public consumption. And there's a commercial side to it for sure. And then the executioner on the back half is going to get the sort of underground sales of bits of human body and bone that are either processed into medical remedies or used as superstitious, religious totems of sorts. So it's all a spectacle. It's very much a spectacle. Seats for sale at Tyburn, for instance, is something that you'll see when people go up at the quote unquote Tyburn tree. So yes, it's very much a public ritual, public festival, has this carnivalesque brutishness, violence at the center of it. But at the end of the day, it's meant to be consumed by the general populace as a warning, but also as a symbol, a living symbol of the power of the crown and their ability to maintain their rule of law. And this goes back, I think, to public, sort of the function in the minds of governments about capital punishment in the public sphere. It goes back to the king of Hammurabi in Babylon. Like, this was part of what they thought at the time, very fair legal system that allowed everybody to see what was on display or what was actually, at the root of their society, at their system of law. So it was very much a public event, very much made for consumption, and very much relied on it being a public event. And it's not until really the tail end of the 1800s and not until the 1900s that you get these public instances of capital punishment. They don't go away until then. In France, it's 1939, England's a bit before. And of course, the war was a big part of France's late use of the guillotine in public. But it's not until the 1900s that you firmly have this process of capital punishment being put behind closed doors and firmly in the hands of technocrats, doctors, people who are multiple degrees away from the death and separated by, apparati of science versus, the executioner's axe, which is very much more corporal and direct.
There's obviously a ton more here that we could explore in terms of these families and the machines and just everything. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use if we want to explore this topic further?
So the most recent work, particularly English language, is going to be Joel Harrington's The Faithful Executioner, which I think is out on Macmillan, and that's published in the last 5 years or so. He also has Joel Harrington. He's a professor at Vanderbilt University, I believe, history professor. He also has an updated translation of Schmidt's Diary, which is quite good. An oldie but a goodie would be the Sanson memoir itself, which was written by the last generation, the eighth or seventh generation of Sanson to pull the lever of the guillotine in France. And it's very fanciful and likely filled with fiction, but it is a great semi-primary source that will allow people to get a somewhat firsthand account of what was going on. And he argues in the preface to that, and the translators as well, that there is a significant amount of unpublished primary sources, letters, documents that went into it. So that's a great read and something that I have read several times. Paul Friedland's Seeing Justice Done is an excellent book on the history of capital punishment and particularly executioners in France. That's on Oxford University Press. Kathy Stewart, she worked, she's at one of the UC branches, a great book on this issue of social pollution, which is called Defiled Trades and Social Outcasts. It's from the 90s, but it's an excellent book. Probably one of the few that really looks at how this issue, and it's not just executioners, it was tanners, people that worked in cemeteries, millers for some reason. Everybody hates millers. I don't know, like Chaucer hated on millers. Everyone hates on millers. I'm not sure. They're so important. Probably because this notion of feeling like one's getting ripped off when you process your work for some kind of value. But millers had horrible social pollution issues in the same way that executioners did. So Kathy Stewart does an excellent job walking you through not only the life of the executioner, but also these other socially dishonorable professions that in many ways were the foundation of infrastructure to the modernizing, industrializing society of England. So it's fascinating.
We'll link to these and more resources in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you go there to find DJ's work as well as these books that we've mentioned here today. DJ, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, goodness. Well, at least I'd have those two excellent Shakespearean works, right? If you believe the rumors, King James Bible. Anyway, given my complete lack of survival skills and being of the generation that lost into the wild, right? Was that movie where the guy makes it into the wild and then eats the wrong berry or mushroom and that ends it all? So I would take a Bear Grylls guidebook, something that would help me on the deserted island. Or I quite like Sapiens, that I like broad, big history text. So maybe something old by Mark Bloch, very old historian. But yeah, a guidebook to help me, because in my upbringing, yeah.
That's a smart, practical choice, I think. Yes.
So, yeah. All this executioner talk has me thinking very practically.
Yeah, let's be careful.
Yeah.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Oddly enough, your request for me to come on was corresponded with efforts to revitalize my interest in executioners. I started early on in my historian career looking at executioners in the early modern period, being trained in it in my master's degree. But as a doctoral student, I moved away from it into other areas, somewhat related: history of medicine, history of intoxicants, early modern period. But I think I would really like to do a more popular history of the Sanson family of executioners and the many, many amazing historical turning points that family lived through, and ultimately, through the turning of their axe and guillotine, pushed society from one epoch to another. And there's a lot more going on, of course, but I think it would make a really good, fascinating read, and not one that's been done yet in a more sort of popular fashion. So in terms of executioners, that's sort of what I'm looking forward to next.
Exciting stuff to come from DJ Guba. Thank you so much for being here today and talking with us about the history of executioners. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Cassidy. This has been great.
As always, there's even more history packed into the show notes for this week's episode. This includes links to the research that DJ mentions, as well as book recommendations, archival images, woodcuts, and some of these pictures that you heard us talk about today. You can see them for yourself in the show notes of the episode. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 144. That's CassidyCash.com/EP144. Are you excited about becoming a member of That Shakespeare Life? Members get access to our digital history activity kits. These kits work like science labs, but for Shakespeare history. We take things like the game of Naughty, a 16th century card game mentioned in Two Gentlemen of Verona, and teach you how to play it with a supply list, step-by-step instructions, a video tutorial that walks you through what it's supposed to look like when you get it right. And we pack a history guide that lets you explore the real history of the game you're playing, so you're learning while you're doing something fun. Each kit comes with these history guides, printable diagrams, and worksheets, as well as curated links to relevant podcast episodes we've covered here on the show, so you can listen to history experts tell you about the activity while you work on it. There's an entire library of kits, and we add new kits regularly. So when you sign up to become a member, you get access to the whole thing, and you can cook, play, and dance your way through the life of William Shakespeare. Sign up today at CassidyCash.com/member. That's CassidyCash.com/member. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.